Madam President, those who follow the UN Security Council meetings on Ukraine have yet another opportunity today to witness this hypocrisy fair staged by our European colleagues so as to demonstrate their all-weather support for the Kiev regime. In practice, despite all the efforts by the organizers, today's meeting only serves to highlight the peculiar interest of London, Paris, Berlin, and other European capitals in continuing the war until the last Ukrainian, so as to try to weaken Russia as much as possible and by hook or by crook rescue what they started in Ukraine in 2014, namely their anti-Russian project that is now swiftly going bust. Not only did Russia consistently sought to prevent the acute crisis in European security triggered by years-long NATO's actions, but also from day one, we expressed our willingness to pursue through peaceful means what we set as the objectives of our special military operation, which we were compelled to launch in February 2022. These objectives imply nothing that any peace-loving state wouldn't legitimately expect from its neighbors. I do doubt that any of those who are vociferating in this chamber their hackneyed mantra about Russian aggression against Ukraine would sit idly by if their neighbor used military force to outlaw the identity of the people living there, glorified Nazi collaborators, banned religions, fomented extreme nationalism, and pursued an aggressive and provocative policy. Sooner or later, this would result in a serious crisis and an armed conflict, which is why neighboring states usually seek to resolve such contradictions by peaceful means, or even better, to prevent them from emerging in the first place. And it is for the UN, regional organizations, and other neighboring countries to assist the states in this regard. However, thanks to the efforts of Western states, this formula did not work in the Ukrainian context, despite Russia's years-long consistent warnings about the looming crisis. The patrons of the Kiev regime were oblivious to these warnings, while, as it turned out, arming the junta and preparing it for war with Russia, with the Minsk agreements providing cover for them. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that the most stubborn among them go on pretending that our special military operation began in a vacuum, and that Ukraine today has no problems that are threatening the very survival of the state. The reality, however, is quite the opposite. I think there's no need to delve into detail about the real problems that Ukraine is confronting today. Almost 12 years after the unconstitutional coup orchestrated by Western capitals, even the Western media outlets, which kept quiet for years, are reporting on this now. Following the game-changing corruption scandals that prompted a number of high-profile resignations, the former comedian and his European sponsors spare no effort to pretend that the Kyiv princeling himself knew nothing about those criminal plots. What is also being hushed up by all means is the truth about the repressive and authoritarian system that has been set up over many years in Ukraine, resulting in thousands of political prisoners. What other country in the world can boast about banning the language spoken by the majority of its population, as well as about unprecedented persecution of a millennium-old canonical faith? And how come that Europe, which brag about its democratic values, deems the aforementioned actions normal? Not only has the Kiev regime driven its own country to poverty and civil war, but also turned Ukraine into a bargaining chip in the geopolitical confrontation between the West and Russia. Ukrainians have already paid a horrific price for these criminal errors and blunders, but now they are compelled to pay even a higher price. Men who do not want to fight are being grabbed in the streets and thrown into a pointless fratricidal meat grinder. Can any of those who called today's meeting clarify why Ukrainians are being forced to fight against their will, even though there are perfectly realistic proposals on the table that can genuinely pave the way to a long-term and lasting settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, which our American colleagues are working painstakingly on? What is this that Ukraine's European sponsors trying to achieve, given that they are well aware how disastrous the situation on the battlefield is for Ukraine? After all, history inexorably shows that each new proposal placed before Ukraine turns out to be less favorable to this country than the previous ones, let alone the hundreds of thousands of senseless losses that this country has sustained due to the criminal actions of its leadership. Madam President, by forcing Ukrainians to fight and reject peace terms offered to them, Kiev's sponsors in the EU are, of course, do not care at all about the fate of Ukraine, nor about its dignity. These are merely fairy tales for pink ponies or guppy fish, as Ukrainian bloggers call the credulous Ukrainian populace. What London, Paris, and Berlin seek is buying time and preparing for war with Russia. This is a crazy idea that Brussels as part of NATO, and especially Brussels as part of the EU, is now advancing as virtually the only ideology uniting European states and distracting their peoples from the socio-economic and political problems that have been by the errors and blunders of their own leadership. Yet, European politicians who have gone mad in their Russophobia and powerlessness are not bothered by the fact that Russia does not threaten to anybody, nor do they care that the topic of a future war is being whipped up solely by them themselves, despite calls for dialogue and appeals to seek solutions to the problems in the field of European security. These calls are now coming not only from Moscow, but also from Washington, with European capitals consistently overlooking them. And all these individuals, such as Macron, Starmer, Merz, von der Leyen, Kallas, and the like, are they really willing to follow in Ukraine's footsteps, putting the future of European children on the altar of their own ambitions? And is the European public really prepared to believe this Russophobic scary stories and to walk down this suicidal path, which in the last 200 years has already led Europe into ruins at least 3 times? After listening to the briefings of our European colleagues in this chamber, we increasingly doubt that the current European elites are of sane mind. Meanwhile, hopes for a swift peace in Ukraine seem ever more illusory. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians do not want to fight for the clique that has usurped power, but it is clear that they will simply be not permitted to end this military madness. Instead of realistic ideas, proposals, and appeals, what we've heard today once again are only false assertions about allegedly targeted strikes by Russian air forces on Ukrainian civilian objects, although everyone in Ukraine knows full well that homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergartens, if they suffer solely due to the Ukrainian air defense, set up in residential areas in violation of international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, none of the organizers of today's meeting mentioned that strikes on energy and transport infrastructure are being promoted and ramped up by Zelenskyy himself, and it is for these strikes that, time and again, he receives painful retaliation. Instead, we heard more fables about Ukrainian children allegedly kidnapped by Russia, with no evidence provided by Ukraine. The truth is that, for all the claims about thousands of Ukrainian children in Russia, Kiev was only able to provide data on 339 children in response to our persistent requests, and much of the information provided was not confirmed after the investigation. In other words, the children's issue is nothing but a mendacious propaganda campaign through which Europe is trying to manipulate the public opinion and vilify Russia. Hence, it is no better than the disgusting hoax in Bucha, with neither Ukraine nor its Western sponsors being able to provide evidence of Russia's involvement in this. The true attitude of the Kiev regime towards Ukrainian children is evidenced by the scandal unfolding in Ukraine over the transfer of about 3,500 orphaned children from the Dnepropetrovsk region to Turkey in 2022 as part of the Childhood Without War initiative, which was overseen by the wife of the Ukrainian president, Elena Zelenskaya. What came to light in the spring of 2024 are chilling facts about psychological pressure vis-à-vis children and mistreatment thereof. Those children were systematically exploited in public propaganda events. The police launched then a criminal investigation, But, as is often the case in Ukraine, the case was swiftly closed and the scandal was hushed up so as not to upset those in power. As a result, none of the organizers of this project, which was carried out under the patronage of Zelensky's spouse, were ever punished. Do our compassionate European colleagues feel like investigating into this case, which has outraged millions of Ukrainians? Of course they don't, because for them, children are nothing but a pretext for another anti-Russian campaign. Colleagues, we do hope that London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels will finally come to their senses, but the hope is scant, and today's meeting unfortunately only attests to this. Too much is already at stake for the elites there, and the bubble of lies they have blown up around the Ukrainian crisis and its true causes has become simply too big. However, we need to remember that it is not only the ambitions and hang-ups of European Russophobes that are in play right now, but also the fate of the whole world, because the armed conflict between Russia and Europe, which the latter is so doggedly seeking, is unlikely to be localized in nature. Washington now fully understands this, and we are grateful to our U.S. colleagues who are trying to make the agitated minds in Europe to get their heads around this obvious truth. We are convinced that everyone should join these efforts, all those who genuinely cherish the ideals of peace, cooperation, and good neighborliness. That is, the very ideals that Europe has forgotten in the anti-Russian frenzy. I think that today no one has any doubts that the goals of the special military operation will be achieved by Russia in any event. The only question is whether we will do this militarily or diplomatically. We reiterate that we prefer the latter, but due to the disruptive actions by European hawks, we still see no robust prerequisites for this. I thank you.